Welcome back to another China Chit-Chat. This time we are joined with our friend Bjarne Bauer from NAI Sofia Group. Uh, just a little bit of housekeeping here before we get into the meat and potatoes of this. Everyone who registered on the Eventbrite page will get a copy of this presentation, so no need to take notes. You'll get a PDF, so all the links here will be clickable. So if you have any questions for Mark or for Bjarne, you could just click their email addresses and send them any questions or follow up questions that you might have after this presentation. And also a link to the recording of this webinar will also be on YouTube, and you'll get a link to that as well. So with that, I'll give a little bit of introduction about our guest speaker, Bjarne Bauer. I won't go through the extensive CV, but Bjarne has over 20 years of experience in commercial real estate, 4 in Germany, but 18 in China. That's pretty incredible, Bjarne. Has it always been an easy ride?
Well, you know what? In a way, yes, because the market was getting better and better year after year, and we were getting more and more experienced. So yes, until very recently, I would say, before COVID.
Yeah, we will get into a little bit of the hiccups along the way in the next couple slides, but maybe let's just jump into it then. Bjarne has been very grateful to provide us some of the insights that NAI Sofia Group has done on the China real estate market. So maybe Bjarne, maybe you can give us kind of the general update here on number 1, 2, and 3 industrial properties, office buildings, and retail.
Sure, absolutely. Because when we speak about real estate, what comes to everyone's mind, of course, immediately is residential, and that's in a way less than 50%, right? And if we think in a business-to-business context, it is a lot about industrial, where we think of factory space, warehouse space, assembly properties, R&D facilities, and so on. And there we see pretty much in all of China, especially here along the East Coast, that actually we still see growth. Of course, logistics be doing tremendously well because of all the growth in e-commerce, but also manufacturing. I mean, the Chinese economy is still growing, right? Even if it's like 6% or 5% instead of 10 or 12% that it was earlier, it's still the economy the size of Switzerland being added every single year. And all of that needs a lot of industrial space. So we see a lot of industrial new buildings being developed, business parks being developed. We see them being sold. We see them being tenanted. So that works very well. We see rates pretty much going up, which at least from an investor's perspective is good. And also from an economic perspective, maybe not for the companies that we often represent, who of course would like to pay lower rents. Offices, let's take Shanghai as an example. We have nowadays about 85%. We have an occupancy of about 85%, meaning we have about 15% of the office buildings in Shanghai being vacant. And of course, that is then mostly in those newer areas, let's say, and also in the greater Hongqiao area and so on. But that is in an international comparison quite healthy. And what is interesting to note is over the past 10, 15 years, the amount of office spaces added to the market went up a lot year on year, but the occupancy, the uptake also. And in the recent few years, we are getting a little bit of a divide there. We are actually still absorbing more and more office space. The companies are still growing, new companies, current companies, and so on. So there's more office space being used, but not at the same speed as new office space is added to the market. So now we have, instead of like 5% vacancies, about 15% vacancies, but that's still regarded as very healthy. And retail also doing, I would say, surprisingly well. However, of course, global investors are very reluctant because they say, look, with all that e-commerce, why should I put my money into retail? It's going down. But when we actually look at a lot of malls, we see that the classical retail, the selling of shoes and cosmetics and fashion and so on, of course, has pretty much disappeared. But we see all sort of food and beverage, which often now occupies about half of the malls, plus all sort of education, plus all sort of entertainment, plus all sort of light medical, dentists, and so on. beauty and so on, massages. So even retail actually doing better than expected.
And before Mark, I want to get your thoughts on this, but I forgot to mention, if anyone has any questions, just feel free to put it in the chat. You can send it to me directly as well, and I'll make sure that the speaker gets to it. Mark, everyone who is on China Chit Chat knows your experience in China, but for our newcomers, you've been working in Shanghai for 27 plus years, something like that. So you've seen a lot of the growth that Bjarne was kind of alluding to before. What just briefly, I guess, based off your experience from back then till now, does what Bjarne say echo, throughout time?
Okay, you kind of got distorted, but I think I guess everybody would think, back in the early days, should have bought more real estate. So I think, it's a lot of expats. I think the people who made the most money were often not the ones who were the CEOs of companies with large housing allowances. It was people that were then perhaps on local contracts and bought their own house. They probably made more money out of China than CEOs. So yeah, I was a bit surprised that retail is performing well, because but that's with COVID and everything. Our experience was always with office buildings. It seemed like it was always hard to get into the AAA, and that buildings always change. So I think that was the other thing. When we moved into the first office that I remember, now it's like probably a C grade office building or a D or E grade, and so that's always, I guess, the issue in Shanghai. It's the new thing. Although I think they've slowed down. Our office in Shanghai office, which is in ICC, that's 10 years old. I think we've been there 10 or 11 years, and that's maintained like an A class address. So yeah, it's interesting.
And going back to what Bjarne was mentioning earlier, that, surprisingly, still a lot of investment being made into China, and especially for real estate. Bjarne, maybe you can give us a little bit of overview on this, and I'll get into the chart at the bottom.
Sure. I mean, when we hear in all the lockdown and supply chain and so on, but let's say a couple of years early, we had the kind of trade war. We had a trade war between the US and China, but we had records amount of US dollars flying in from the US at the time. So the businesses are not necessarily following a political agenda. They're just looking, where the money is, so to say. And in terms of investment into real estate, of course, we have a big part from my point of view, which is just classical for FDI, foreign direct investment. It's a company, that buys a plot of land, builds a facility, and so on. That's one kind. And then we have, and that's maybe equally interesting, the institutional money, the global private equity groups, the insurance companies, the pension funds, and so on. And they all have set aside certain percentages of their funds. And even if those are small percentages, it's billions of dollars for Chinese industrial real estate. And that mostly means for them, of course, logistics properties, because that's an easy product for them to mentally grasp and to let. If one tenant leaves, you give it to another tenant, and they all believe in the e-commerce story. So even, with political tensions most recently between Australia and China, for example, you still see Australian pension fund pumping money into the Chinese real estate market. That also shows that these groups believe in China's stability, both in terms of economy, also in terms of political stability, legal stability, and so on. We see, and maybe we have examples later, I'm not sure, but we see all the world's largest asset managers, let's say like BlackRock from the US. We see the private equity groups, let's say like Warburg Pincus, Carlyle, Blackstone, and so on. They all have exposure in this field, and they would actually, as based on what I hear, like to get more exposure, at least some of them. So there is money actually flowing in.
And thank you for that. The bottom graph there is from the European Chamber's Business Confidence Report issued just this year. They invited 620 respondents of their members to survey this, and I think it is quite enlightening. The survey, to put it in context though, the survey was conducted during February and March of 2022, which is kind of a tricky time for China, but I think it's still a on the pulse survey. And you will see from on the right-hand side, the jump from 2021 to 2022 shows an increase. It is kind of supporting Bjarne's assertion here, and that there is more investment being made. I'll just go, this is the last one from the business survey, but it goes a little bit to the point that Bjarne was talking about in terms of politics and trade war. The onshoring that we heard about 2 years ago during the trade war, there was a lot of huff and puff in the media about it. But I guess the question is, if you're going to relocate, where are you going to relocate to? And you will see this graph here from the EU chamber kind of shows that, once they're in China, they kind of don't have many other options. Now, maybe that's not just because of the political aspect. That might be because inflation is definitely a big concern right now in 2022. Currency is a big issue in 2022. So there is a lot of factors going on beyond just, just simply relocating or simply onshoring, like Bjarne was mentioning before. Mark, before we jump into the next slide, we'll get into some graphs on some charts about some of the numbers, but did you want to add anything onto this?
Yeah, I think, since I was in China, there were always three, themes. One was there's going to be less expats, even when there weren't many expats. So I guess that's coming true now. There's many less expats. The other one was that residential retail prices will go down. We'll see what Bjarne says. I saw the slide deck, but it might be, maybe it's not totally up to date. So, that also kind of happening. But this, offshoring or reshoring or whatever, people have been talking about that for a long time. And I only remember one or two cases where it happened. And it was cases where China wasn't really, interested in that kind of stuff. It was like textiles going to Cambodia or Bangladesh. So I think probably, I was in Germany for 2 trips last 2 weeks. And I think the sentiment there is, I don't think anyone's going to really exit China, but maybe the next factory they do, they'll look for somewhere else. So I don't think they're going to, but I don't know if there's going to be a big doubling down. I think probably going forward, because it's not easy to move a factory. I mean, there's all the supply chain issues, all these kind of things. It's very disruptive.
Well, and even those companies, let's say they have 5 to 10 factories in China, and they are experimenting, and they have what we call the China +1 or China +2, and they have one more factory in Vietnam or India or Thailand or Malaysia and so on. And even now I have clients, they are now considering, okay, where do we put the next one? And they were again putting it in China because they say that's where we have the access to talent, to engineers, to raw materials, to suppliers, all of that. And of course, as you just said, Mark, yes, if that's textile or a shoe factory, okay, you have everything for a shoe factory in Vietnam. But let's say if you're in the automotive business and now you put your new plant in Thailand, well, you still need all your suppliers from mainland China. And if there were a new lockdown, then you would still be affected just as much as if you were in China itself. So that is what I see among our.
Yeah, so I think that's all correct. Yeah, we probably don't have that many clients who come to us who establish 6 factories. They probably don't come to a lawyer for the next factory because they've already got their kind of template. So I probably don't see that much of that. We do see people who have 5 or 6 factories, and it was in the heyday of the 2000s where they built up too much capacity. They thought, and so I don't think these guys are leaving, but there's an opportunity for Bjarne and for others that they would like to, get rid of that company. And as we'll discuss at the end, very often the only real valuable asset in that company is the land and possibly the building.
Yeah, we'll get into that.
Absolutely. Shall we go into that right now? Or I think we have some other slides from Sean first, I guess.
Yeah. We'll go. Sean will control the. Okay, Sean, please continue.
No, we'll get into, this is all juicy stuff and then we're going to get to it. But I guess we just want to set the scene for everybody who might have heard but doesn't really understand the China real estate market in terms of industrial and retail and residential. But Bjarne, here we have some of the research that NAI Sofia Group has done. This one is, this is specifically for Shanghai, but Shanghai as a big commercial hub in China is kind of a leading indicator of trends. So please, could you walk us through this one? This is the industrial rental rates.
Sure. This is an interesting one, because it is about the rental rates, simply put, of factories. And we see that in the year 2013, so about 8 years ago, we were at about 30 something Chinese yuan per square meter per month. Meaning, sometimes in office we talk about per day. It's like if it's 30 per month, well, then it's 1 per day, and that has pretty much doubled, roughly speaking. Here it shows a little less, but that is also partly because the city has been growing. So the average grew, but if you take one location in Zhangjiang High-Tech Park or in Zhaohejing, that location would actually have slightly more than doubled in terms of rental income. And that increase, I think, might be somewhat similar to the rental developments we see in residential apartments, maybe a little less. And that may be a little bit less than when we think of the value increase, but somewhat similar, like rents are about doubling, the value of these assets are about doubling. And then, of course, if you would now deduct inflation, because in China we always had relatively high inflation rates, well, then you still see an upward curve or an upward whatever line, but not that very much. And that's exactly, of course, what these funds are living off. They put their money there, and they, of course, need to outperform inflation, and they need to have a return. And that's exactly what happens. And industrial has relatively high yields, meaning if you put $1 million, you can you used to be able to get like $100,000 per year in rental income for it. So a return of almost about 10%, because the companies, it's a bit more a B2B thing, and things are written off over shorter periods of time. So it's a different animal than residential. So more sophisticated investors, even private investors, would often in the past would have liked to put their money into retail properties instead of apartments, and nowadays would like to put it into industrial kind of property types or funds or whatever.
I had a question here, and but I also wanted to note that this is up-to-date information, but not for 2022 so far. And we know that 2022 is kind of it's a little bit different than previous years. The question that I received was, how does are the recent lockdowns affecting the industrial rental rates?
Not based on what we see. I mean, you have certain cities that have certain business parks, especially if they're invested by state-owned enterprises and so on, that are very speculative. They build, and we have certain business parks, where they pretty much build office buildings in an industrial area. Well, who wants to have their office way out in Zhongjiang district or way out in whatever a satellite city of Ningbo or Hangzhou? So these kind of spaces are, of course, harder to fill up. But when you have the kind of premises that the market needs and wants, single-story factories with 2 or 3 layers of office space at the beginning, a 2 or 3-story warehouse with a ramp going up, and so on, then we still see a lot of demand. I mean, there is clearly growth. It's really going up. It's just a question, are we going up faster than before? No, we're going up slower than before. This is a good one that you're showing, that one, industrial vacancy rates. We had relatively high vacancy rates at times, and now we are having lower vacancy, but that has always been at about that level, at about 15%, 16%. And of course, in industrial also, what happens is once a factory building becomes vacant, it takes easily a year or a year and a half to find a new tenant, and that new tenant will again be there for 10, 20 years. It's not like an office where you 3 months later have a new tenant and 2 or 3 years later they move out again. It's just a little bit of a more long-term kind of thing, I would say.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And here we just have a kind of a juxtaposition of the industrial rentals and vacancy rates in Shanghai. Maybe we'll talk about retail now. And I know we've mentioned this before about the e-commerce and maybe even more so the lockdown. The lockdown might not have affected the industrial as much as the retail. So maybe you can walk through us this side.
Sure, absolutely. Also, I would like to mention, and of course, that's a little bit also some trickery, those owners of these properties, they want to not show that any rate is decreasing. So even if there was a decrease, that would most often be disguised as longer rent-free periods, more congestions, and so on. But what we did see prior to the so-called financial crisis in 2006-07, and what we saw also after the financial crisis in 2011, 12, 13, is that retail companies, for example, they were buying into that China growth story, and they were fighting for market share. They were not fighting for profitability. So you would see retail rates in Shanghai, let's say on Nanjing Road West, at the Jing'an Temple area, at the Portman Ritz-Carlton, at the Jing'an Kerry Center, and so on, the Plaza 66, all of those buildings that were almost like not sustainable. They were Manhattan rates, and a lot of the brands said, yes, but that's our footprint and that's our showcase, and they had all sort of explanations, and that came a bit under pressure. So we saw the rents really declining, and also nowadays the rents are pretty much flat. And even while being flat, if you have a kind of 3D or room escape kind of operator, that's a small business that we together start. Of course, we are not as able to burn through cash if you would compare it to whatever, some global fashion brand and so on. So retail rates certainly have been under pressure, but then again, never to the extent that a lot of people predicted. Now with e-commerce everything goes down and goes to nothing, and here and there. I mean, nowadays I was yesterday in a mall, and you see lines in front of all of the restaurants. You need a dentist appointment, you need to wait, and so on. Certainly I see a lot of activity. Like I'm not worried about the Shanghai economy, at least.
Yeah, Mark, maybe I get your thoughts on this, because I've been with you for many years, and I've heard you talk about in the old days when these Bjarne mentioned earlier just now, the luxury retail brands want to come in and they want to open as many stores as possible, because they want to get that presence in Shanghai or Beijing or whatever tier 1, tier 2 city, and they want to just make their brand known. I don't know if that kind of strategy is still relevant, or maybe I could get Bjarne's opinion on this later, but just get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I think it's a weird business. We've done some work for the luxury brands, in the past, and as so often as in life, the rich don't really have to pay as much. So a mall will actually really want these guys because they bring foot traffic and all this kind of stuff. So these buggers, often dictate the terms, and then other smaller brands have to fight tooth and nail for a reasonable size space. I think the other reason why they do it, it's probably changed a bit now with COVID, but COVID won't be around forever. I think a lot of it was which is hard for Chinese distributors to really get measure the value. It was also to be like a marketing campaign for Chinese tourists. When they went abroad, they would buy these products. So these things are like showrooms, not necessarily a place where you transact. So I guess for all those reasons, that's not going to go away, I guess.
I fully agree, and I don't want to make this too long. So yes, this is exactly what we see happening.
So here we have the vacancy rates, which you kind of alluded to, Bjarne, but also it seems pretty flat.
Yes, and pretty low. But the thing is this, if you are a shopping mall, you can always find someone that wants that space, right? That shopping mall and street front is always in a good location. So you can always find someone. The question is, okay, how well do they fit within the image you want to have and all your client mix, and how much do they pay? So that is more the problem with retail. And let's say in a typical mall, right? Of course, the mall also, they don't want to have vacant units sitting there, especially on the ground floor. And you can always find another coffee shop and another this and that. And then on the higher floors, okay, finally you make a food court or in the underground. And finally you have a cinema. And then if you have a 9-story shopping mall and really nobody ever wants to go higher than the 8th floor, then on the 9th floor you put a self-storage facility where people can store their things and so on. So you can always find tenants for retail properties. The question is, okay, how much rent do they pay and how does that compare to the investment you originally made? And are you getting that return that you really anticipated and so on?
I got a question here. The question is kind of what Mark just alluded to. Maybe Mark, you take a first stab at it and let Bjarne give his thoughts. But the bigger brands having more leverage in negotiation. Is that something that is true from your experience?
Yeah, well, my experience, we're talking about retail clients,
Yeah.
Basically, well, my experience has been, unfortunately, we haven't acted for the very big brands that often. If you take a big brand like a Kia, they have so much leverage, they build their own, they become a real estate magnate, because they can, increase the value of them all. So they build their own malls. We did some work for them early on. But those other big Italian or French fashion brands, I think what we've found is it's very hard to negotiate the terms of a contract if you're a brand. So we don't really tell clients to try too hard. Yeah, we'll give them a bit of a, heads up. But just the way that negotiations work in China, the salespeople are not authorized to change anything. And, some of the Hong Kong leases are the worst things. God knows who wrote them. It's like they took the worst Hong Kong lease, added in some Chinese lease stuff, then they thought about stuff again, and then anything that ever happened is in the lease. So there was one which was something like, you couldn't even, terminate the lease if there were rats in the, like they were just like excluding everything, and you can't change a comma. So I guess, the only thing we ever were successful in doing is you might add a supplementary amendment, which kind of changes some of it. That's the biggest trick. But I think, especially if you look at these kind of vacancy rates and everything, if it's a good location in Shanghai, you don't have a lot of time. If you and and you ask head office and their in-house counsel looks at it, then the global real estate guy looks at it, the lease will be gone within a few weeks. So, that's the other problem. Yeah, we did that. We have that diagram. Remember, Sean, with the lease? That was the story.
Well, exactly. And now I wish more of the clients that we deal with would be represented by you, Mark, and team, that know how these things work, because that's, of course, exactly what tends to happen, that the client says, oh, I want such and such and such. And the landlords are often perceived as very bullish, as very tough, as being arrogant at times. But of course, also we have to understand, if you are that developer and you own that, let's say the Plaza 66, and you have something like 300 office tenants there and 150 retail tenants, of course, you don't want to have a different contract for each one of them. And maybe, again, you are getting some of your capital from the institutional, from some fund, from some pension fund or this or that. And they may, again, require you to keep their asset and their cash flow safe and so on. So they also have reasons why they do it like that. But of course, the main reason being they can. And to that question about, are the bigger brands having it easier? Yes. For example, when it started that car brands would go into shopping malls, and Tesla was obviously the first one, then they were attractive and they had it very easy. And when Starbucks want to go somewhere, they have it very easy, because an office building and a mall, they all want a Starbucks. So it's relatively easy for the Starbucks to get a good corner position and not even pay all that much. So you need a good retail team, like hopefully us, if if you are that new brand, you know, if you are that Bang & Olufsen high-end speaker brand newly entering the Chinese market, wanting to get the Xintiandi ground floor corner store before the market knows how fancy and attractive and whatever you are. And there was a time, but that's better now. I think both in terms of contract clauses, legal terms, there's more space to negotiate nowadays than it used to be. And also nowadays, and that's maybe a positive side effect of more efficient and clean and more integral government and everything, is even in the developers, there used to be a time when these international big brands, in addition to paying crazy rents, had to pay so-called key fees. So an upfront fee of 6 months in rent, just in order to get the previous tenant out, which often was a farce, was just a made up thing. So you had to pay 6 months as a one-time fee, plus 3 months deposit, plus 3 months rent for your first quarter. So 1 year in rent kind of at the very beginning. Plus you had to pay something under the table to the people that were handling these matters. Otherwise, you just would not be considered for those most attractive. And that has changed, and that is healthy. That has changed. It has changed both on the legal and ethical side of things, and it also changed in terms of the market. It's just not required. If you're a good brand and you pay normal rents, then you can hopefully get that space.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, Bjorn. I think the competition, the amount of eyes, the amount of traffic now is just, it's a very efficient market. I mean, just to quickly summarize this up, by looking at this graph, we see that the rents are going down, but they're not, but they are stabilizing, and the vacancy rates have always been very low and also very flat. So yeah, you can see a little bit of a trend there in that respect. And I don't want to spend too much time on this next section. I'd rather get into the meat of it a little bit later. But Bjarne, I thought it would be kind of appropriate because of the residential market in China has kind of been in the news recently. So maybe speaking to someone who's kind of in the business, just to get your thoughts on the residential market in China.
Yes, sure. And cut me off if in case I make this too long. And be aware, everyone, that this graph starts at 2006. So we are now talking about a 15-year or 16-year period. And of course, as we all noticed and realized, okay, at that time in 2006, people were already talking about the Chinese real estate market being overheated because people's salary compared to the purchase prices were so high and so on. And since then, the prices went up something like 500%. And again, this is average for Shanghai, and Shanghai grew a lot. If you take that very same apartment in the Huangpu district, it went probably up much more than 5 times. And we see nowadays, and China did that well. Yes, let's go into this one. This is a nice one. If we look at apartment prices, then of course we see that New York is way more expensive than, let's say, Paris or Shanghai. And I've put Frankfurt there because, as you can hear from my accent, I'm obviously from Germany. So that is, but the interesting thing is when you look at how does that compare, if that's weighted, when we look at people's, let's say, the GDP per person, the GDP per capita. So if you go to the next slide, yes, exactly. So here we see that suddenly Frankfurt is very affordable because in the first place, it wasn't all that expensive compared internationally. And then the Germans earn pretty well, whereas Paris is much more expensive than Frankfurt because A, their real estate is more expensive, B, they earn a little less. New York is somewhat on par with Paris because yes, real estate is more expensive, but everybody earns much more and so on. And the outlier here is Shanghai, where the real estate is so expensive and the average income is not that high. It's not at a New York level. So we have kind of New York real estate prices, but we don't have New York salaries. And that's, of course, what we all suffer from. That's why we all feel we should have higher salaries and lower rentals or lower purchase prices. And the purchase prices, of course, are worse than the rentals. So people feel, oh, my rents are so high and they're so expensive and they go up so much. Yes, but in comparison to the purchase prices of these apartments, rents are actually supposed to be regarded as attractive. So that is what, and we see nowadays, of course, with the recent things, the developers, the government, the red line policies, the government not allowing the banks to give funding to the developers, the government requesting developers to have like 50% equity. You know, in the past, it was less than 10%. Of course, if you go from less than 10% to 50%, every developer is like in a shock. Nobody buys anything. You know, and I have to say, you know, you can criticize a country and a government for many things, but I don't want to criticize the Chinese government for doing what they said they would do and what everybody requires them to do to cool down a little bit this crazy real estate market. And President Xi, since coming to power, said, I will cool this down. And he tried a lot of things, or the government tried a lot of things, and nothing really worked. And then about 2 years ago, they started with these red line policies. And immediately when they issued, we said, okay, that means that Evergrande and Sunak will be bankrupt. Everybody knew that. And then they followed through. They did what they promised to do. And now we have the real estate companies being controlled by the government, by state-owned enterprises and so on, which if you don't add more apartments, that could mean prices skyrocket. But that's also what the government doesn't want. So we have now, in a way, pretty much what the government promised to do and wanted to do. And if that should now go downward, the government can at any point in time say, okay, fine, now dear developers, instead of 50% equity, you can work with 20% equity. It's still better than before. And now big banks, you can borrow money again. And they're doing that already. The government has already set up this fund to bail out these failed projects and so on. From that point of view, I look at the real estate market as maybe not perfectly healthy, but healthier than ever before. Also, the amount of money that's paid off. Also, if you look at people's salaries, income compared to the cost of real estate, all these measurements are now better than before. Maybe they're not perfect, but they're better than before.
Yeah, I like that a lot. You know, I think, you know, not healthy, but healthier than before. You know, it's kind of like a growing pains, but backwards a little bit. Mark, do you have any comments on this, or?
I hope he's right. I hope, because I want to sell my apartment in Shanghai. So, you know, if anybody watching knows somebody, you know, please contact me separately.
And if you use the coupon code China Chit-Chat, you'll get 10% off.
Yeah, 10% off. Yes, that's right.
All right. So getting to one of the main topics we wanted to discuss today, the sale and leaseback. Now, I have to admit, Bjarne, this is something that I'm not super familiar with. I know Mark has a little bit more experience in this than I do. But if you could just gently guide some of our listeners on what is a sale and leaseback and what are the advantages of a sale and leaseback?
Sure. So let's take a very simple example. You have a Japanese or German or French or whatever company, machines, whatever they do something, right? And they got bought or sold or whatever, they got bought by a private equity. And that private equity company is, of course, keen to get out some cash. So because that's often their business model, or for whatever other reason, you know, you want to set free capital. So what can happen is that company says, well, look, we are actually a tool maker. We are not a real estate company. So we sell our factory to a real estate investment company, and we rent it back from them. And that's what we call sale and leaseback. You sell your factory and you sign a 10-year or whatever, 8-year, 10-year, 12-year lease agreement, you rent it back. And we have seen and done some of these transactions successfully in Shanghai and in other cities in Jiangsu and Zhejiang. So this is something, and interestingly enough, there is more capital chasing those opportunities that there are companies willing to sell. So there is definitely a lot of interest from investors for that kind of arrangement. And maybe there will be more companies interested to do that, maybe because they need the money or because of political reasons or strategies or concerns. They want to be more asset light. They regard that as de-risking, right? Which is a bit our topic today. So to limit that risk. But then somewhat related to that is, of course, you can sell your current premises and move into other premises which you rent. Is basically the same logic. And sometimes that kind of happens because anyways you need more space, or anyways you need cheaper space, or anyways there are strict environmental regulations in Shanghai, and you want to move to a neighboring city in, let's say, Pinghu in Jiaxing, or somewhere else in Jiaxing, or Haining in Zhejiang, or towards Hangzhou, Ningbo, or towards up here, you know, the Suzhou direction, the Kunshan, the Changshu, the Zhangjiagang, all of that, the Nantong. So that is really happening. And sometimes it's also not clear what's the main driver. You know, is the main driver I need the money, or is the main driver I need more space, or I need to cut costs? I feel sometimes the companies are kind of trying to sell it as a growth project, while in reality it can also be a cost saving exercise at the same time. What we also see, and you on the call, you may all have similar experiences, you know, 10-15 years ago, my typical business was I'm helping an American or European or Canadian or whatever Australian company to buy a plot of land or to buy a factory, and the seller was almost always a Chinese company, and the buyer was always a foreign company. And nowadays it's upside down. Nowadays I'm helping that Western company to sell their premises in Shanghai or a city nearby Shanghai, and almost all of the buyers are Chinese companies, which are more bullish, which believe that the market will go up and China will go up and all of that.
You started mentioning a little bit about the structure, so I just wanted to switch the slide to
Sure, maybe.
Well done.
Sure, maybe it's also worthwhile just on that. I think just some other background is, I think there's a lot more scope for this than people probably think, because firstly, you know, very often, say a German company, a manufacturing company, they don't normally buy the land anywhere in the world. You know, they don't really want to buy land. You know, they're a manufacturer, not a real estate company. But 20 years ago, those guys didn't really have much of a choice. It was more like, we have to build the factory to ensure the quality and these kind of things. So I think a lot of, and also if you did a business plan 20 years ago, what are the chances that you've got exactly the right size of factory for what you need, you know? And, you know, what is even the chance that you actually put it in the right location? You know, like maybe all your supply chain is in South China, but you're in Shanghai. So I think probably a lot of people would like to de-risk, or they, it's not easy to relocate, you know, because, you know, you've got employees in Shanghai, all this stuff. So these are big projects, but I think now it might be the time that people actually have to think about it. Probably 10 or 20 years ago, it's so disruptive, but probably it's also a headquarters decision, because, you know, a Shanghai general manager of a manufacturing entity will not have a great interest of relocating the business, you know, into Inner Mongolia or something. So, you know, I think, yeah, this is something headquarters has to think about. And I imagine there's a bit of a education piece, because I think a lot of people don't understand you can sell the, you know, the buildings in China. People think, oh, it reverts to the government, and of course, with the land use rights being limited, but you can renew them. So I think often, you know, people don't know the options available, and management in China are not very clear to, you know, clarify this for them, because they would prefer to stay where they are.
I think this,
Yes.
some of the earlier slides was just kind of to set the scene. And I think to set the scene, we wanted to show that the real estate prices have obviously gone up in the past 20 years, but also the competitiveness and the experience of the Chinese parties in dealing with real estate has also improved drastically. So these types of options, like the sale and leaseback, like you said, Mark, is becoming more of a consideration than it was maybe 10 years ago. So with that said, Bjarne, you were talking a little bit about the structuring of the sale and leaseback, and I think this is the crux of it. So if you could just give us a little bit of details about it.
Yes. So of course, what happens is, and that's of course what makes this so attractive, companies bought that plot of land 15, 20 years ago when it cost almost nothing. And if they were a little bit lucky and a little bit smart, they bought granted land use rights and didn't get some allocated land use rights that can be revoked at any time. So let's hope they have granted land use rights and they have land use rights that can be transferred, and they bought 50 years and now they have still 30 years left. then they have something attractive here. No matter they sell and rent somewhere else, or they sell and they lease their property themselves. And interestingly, Shanghai is nowadays most often only issuing 20 years land use rights for industrial. So, it used to be that you said, hey, I have 30 years left. And the buyer would say, oh, then I have to discount by 40% because almost half of the period is up. But now we say, look, I have 30 years left. You're getting 10 years more than the government would give you. So that further increases that value. And that, of course, went up a lot already. Now, of course, the taxes are also pretty harsh. You have these taxes going up, and for whatever, and your value, whatever your capital appreciation, that's more than 100%. It's like the tax rate is 50%. And for whatever is more than 200%, it's like up to 60%. And so on. So often on paper, you bought the plot of land for, let's say, $10 million, and now it's worth $100 million. But you also have to remember, oh, you got to give 30, 35, 40 million to the government in taxes. Okay, but still you have these $60 million. And nowadays, if you then move somewhere else and you rent, and let's say you move from a Shanghai to a Kunshan or to a Taizang, where they're very hungry for that kind of employment and for that kind of investment and technology and all of that, then you may get a subsidy package. So if then you rent your new premises for, let's say, a period of 10 years, and the government says, I subsidize your rent by 50%, then you have a very sweet deal, because instead of having expensive real estate in Shanghai, no matter you own it or you rent it, you're moving to a place that's cheaper, plus the government is paying part of your rent. So you basically say, oh, my real estate seems to be pretty much free of charge, at least for the first 10 years. I have all that money. I can put some of that as a dividend to my headquarters. I can put some of that into my investment over here. I can relocate some of my core talent, their talent, relocation programs. They get all sort of bonuses, all sort of talent housing access, all that's the kind of things to sweeten it up for them. Maybe some people, you're actually happy they are not joining you, because maybe you want to refresh a bit your workforce. So this is really what we see quite a lot.
So I think we've got a potential client. Actually, just I haven't talked to them yet, but someone just told me about them. And so they've got a factory in a city which you think would still want to attract investment, but it is a place which I know has pushed some of our clients out in the past because of the increasing environmental standards. So, you always have to move a bit more inland, etc. So I don't know all the details, but I was just thinking, really, if it's in an established kind of manufacturing area in one of those kind of cities, it must be relatively easy to sell to another company, because it might be just they'd have to use it for a more environmentally friendly process. Is that also your feeling? Because I think that the original idea from the lawyers was to somehow negotiate with the government, but I think the much quicker and elegant thing would be just to sell. And one thing which we've looked at in the past, I have to refresh my memory though, sometimes what we do is we sell the company, not the land. And that will cut down the tax. But there's a lot to be done. So these are complicated. That's why we didn't put it into today's thing, because it gets too complicated. But maybe, Sean, if there's interest, we could do a follow-up at some stage on these kind of, more grittier issues.
Yes, and Mark, you're absolutely right. And of course, what we also see is we see companies moving from Shanghai to Suzhou, and another company is moving from Suzhou to Changzhou, another company is moving from Changzhou to Zhenjiang. So there is this move, and of course, some companies make a big mistake by moving from Shanghai all the way, thousands of kilometers away, and just by moving actually 200 kilometers away, where they still have a high-speed rail. You're right. Let's say, for example, Changzhou, a very attractive city, 45 minutes by high-speed train from Shanghai. The cost structure is so much cheaper than Shanghai in terms of real estate, in terms of talent, in terms of everything else. But that is definitely the case. And the government sometimes would give you, of course, a compensation offer. And I think what's attractive about that, usually that's definitely lower than what you can fetch on the market, but that's usually tax-free. So there can be a situation where you say, fine, I'm willing to sacrifice some of my gains because then it's tax-free. What we also
but it's always complicated.
Yes?
On the tax, it's very complicated. So I'd be scared of going into too much detail. The tax-free is normally only if you're going to reinvest it to reinstate a production and stuff like that. So that's why I think it's complicated. We have to be a bit careful about
Sure. Maybe I'm oversimplifying here, and we don't want to give people wrong hopes or the wrong impression, but what we have indeed done is we helped a foreign company, help them sell their premises in a very difficult situation, about ownership rights, transferability of land use right, or would there be a change of zoning, all of that. And it was clear that the foreign company couldn't handle that, and they wouldn't really benefit from that upside. So they sold to a Chinese state-owned company, because that Chinese state-owned company, they had the confidence that they might get maybe that zoning changed or those land use rights getting renewed and all of that. So that can also be an avenue that you say, okay, fine, I just want to be out of there, give me my money, and then you guys can figure out a more complicated deal.
Yeah, this is
so we've seen that
nuanced
as well. Like, even if somebody wants to exit the market, I know that we have slides that people don't do it, but sometimes people want to exit a site, or maybe exit totally, or exit one factory. And one of the advantages there is, I think most Western companies would ensure, at least contractually, and do their best to ensure that the employees get their severance and the creditors are paid off, etc. But selling the company to a Chinese state-owned enterprise, they're probably going to be much better at winding up the business and rechanging it than the foreign business. So that, and you get rid of that whole problem off your plate. The other advantage is, I know there's a slide later, but if you sell the company, you should be able to get the money offshore because the owner is offshore. So it's but we'll talk about it at some other stage. But just
there's two case studies here, and they are pretty similar, but I wanted to put them in here so that everyone who's watching can refer to it when you get the PDF in the email. But I guess one of the key differences here, and this was provided by Bjarne, is the negotiation of the lease, the sale and leaseback. So Bjarne.
That was an American company and situated in Yancheng. Is that already the second one? Maybe let's go one up, Sean. Yes, and then we just said, okay, look, we can help you sell that, and that was a facility of about 14,000 square meters, which is big but not huge. The value was about 40 million RMB, right? So what is that? Maybe, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 million US dollars. And in Yancheng, which is still Jiangsu, which is a good province, but it's pretty much the north of Jiangsu. So it's, of course, not as attractive as Nantong or Suzhou or something like that. So we couldn't sell that, to a big international, whatever, investment fund. But we found a family office out of Hong Kong that loves to have Chinese industrial real estate and loves to have these relatively high returns. Now, I don't want to give away any business secrets or something, but very roughly, you get a 10% return on this. And that's, of course, what those guys look into. They say, great, after 10 years, I got my investment back. Plus, hopefully, the value stayed the same or increased. So I have a double dip. We had lease agreements signed. Those were, of course, a bit complicated, 8 + 4 + 4 years, and so on. So that was an interesting thing. A big hurdle was we needed a rent guarantee from the headquarters. The landlord said, look, this is a location where I'm afraid I might not quickly find a replacement tenant. So please, dear headquarters, guarantee me that lease at least for these first 8 years. And if you go bankrupt after year 1, or you leave the market after year 1 or whatever, you still will pay me 7 years in rent. That was the difficult part in this transaction. Finally, thankfully, it worked out. Now let's go to the next slide, which is a much bigger transaction. And it's a little bit simplified here, obviously. But we had a German company that had this kind of a private equity situation that I mentioned earlier. So they were asked to get that money out, and they just sold their premises and they said, okay, fine. We were able to find them a buyer. It was a bit less than 100 million Chinese yuan. And they signed a lease agreement for 10 years. And of course, with the rent escalation and with the cap, what happens when we renew, we have priority and the rent can be negotiated according to market rate, but within such a frame and so on. And the company was regarded as a strong tenant. So there was no rental guarantee from the headquarters needed. And it was bought by a real estate fund that does this kind of transaction. And here we say a fund company backed by Warburg Pincus. What happened is actually it was bought by a company that has a portfolio or that assembles a portfolio of these deals, and that would then sell it to a vehicle of Warburg Pincus or to another big private equity group once it's bundled. And that is also interesting enough, one business model in our industry, that you are a group, a smaller private equity or whatever fund, you acquire a couple of deals, you put them together as a portfolio, you sell them to a bigger guy. And of course, the bigger guy has less return, but also less worries since you did the legwork for them. So this is something that definitely is happening in the market. And if you need something like that, let us know. We are very happy to facilitate. But then again, my personal opinion being, keep it. I love real estate, and as a real estate freak, I believe you should buy real estate and shares and then never ever touch it. And then 50 or 100 years later, your children or grandchildren will be very wealthy. So personally, I believe that ownership is something good. But from a business perspective, if you want to go asset light or de-risk, if you want to do all these things, then of course we are also happy to help.
And of course, if
you might want
use
to spend some
code,
of the money on yourself, but you can spend some of the money on yourself, not your bloody kids. But anyway,
use the coupon code, get 10% off Bjarne's services. But we talked
and a free
Bjarne
set of steak knives.
But Bjarne mentioned that there are business strategic decisions on why one might want to kind of lighten the load of the portfolio a little bit. And I did have one question here, but I just let them know that we will get to that. And Mark, maybe you can talk about how to get the money out of China, because there is I guess it is kind of a general feeling, whether right or wrong, that this is a pretty difficult transaction. So if you'd care to share a little bit.
Yeah. So I think we'll probably do one more detailed on this. So I'll just make, because we only have 3 minutes left as well. So just very quickly, I think one of the issues is when you want to realize that money, what do you want to do with the money? Like Bjarne mentioned, some private equity guys say get the money back. That's not always necessarily easy. One thing which we've seen is a capital reduction or decrease of registered capital. Say 10 or 15 years ago, it was like seeing a Yeti or the Loch Ness Monster. People claim to see it, but very few people see it in practice. But this now is much easier. So, I think it is, legwork. It will depend on the local authorities. But let's say if there was, a value of 100 million, you should be able to decrease the registered capital. There'll be all kinds of complexity because, the registered capital will not be the same as the amount of money you got. You know what I mean? So registered capital is a constant. So if you've got a registered capital of 10 million renminbi, you bought the real estate for 10 million, it's now worth 100 million, your registered capital is still 10 million. So there's these kind of complexities to look at. Whether you sell the company or you sell the real estate, tax issues, foreign exchange issues. And then I think, if we look at a relocation, the last one we did that was able to be done was like 20 years ago, that we were able to relocate a company from Beijing to Shandong. Since then, it's very difficult to do it. So whenever we've seen it in the last few years, we did one recently from Hangzhou to Shanghai, going against the flow, but they moved from Hangzhou to Shanghai. And in that case, because it's theoretically possible, but it's just easier to liquidate and set up a new company. And that liquidation in this example, that wasn't the intention in the other one. The liquidation would allow you to get the money out. So anyway, we do have a foreign exchange team, and they can help sometimes on the foreign exchange, because that's the big issue, is what do you do with the cash and how does it get out? How much is it going to be taxed? And then just very briefly on the joint ventures, because we just have to wind up now. I think the issue is, what I found is a lot of joint ventures have problems, and often real estate solves the problem, because basically the Chinese partner, maybe 20 years ago, it was always the foreign partner would buy out the Chinese partner. Nowadays, it's almost 50, I'd say it's 50-50, if not a few more Chinese partners buy out the foreigner. And so very often a key value of the business, because the foreigners will not want to give the IP rights and stuff like that, but a key value is actually the real estate. So that can really be the good exit. I mean, I think we have some clients who never made money manufacturing anything in China, but they made a lot of money on the real estate accidentally. That's the so I think there's a lot to look into, but that was just the highlights.
Thanks a lot, Mark. Bjarne, I just want to get your final word on this. Maybe do you see that what Mark said about the real estate as kind of a gift in disguise for some of these international clients with Chinese partners kind of having issues, but then the real estate solves the problem?
Absolutely, absolutely. For joint ventures as well as for other situations, having that real estate and having the possibilities to work and play with it and doing things, sometimes also you have still vacant land left next to your factory. The government may at some point want to see more tax revenue, want to reclaim it. You may rather want to put up something, put a little shed, put a little warehouse, rent it out, or create something. And then in some cases, once you have more properties, you might even still difficult, you might be able to split the land and so on. There are a lot of somewhat complex things there, but of course in these complex situations lie also those opportunities. But of course that is often like the saving grace, that you say, okay, maybe my machine, I can't move my crane in my machine, or a lot of things have depreciated, but the real estate has really appreciated a lot, and that can of course help a lot of things. And of course the government also knows that, and as always in life, and especially in China, you got to make sure that finally everybody somehow benefits. Like, you will never get all of it, right? I mean, because even granted land use rights can now, especially nowadays, not be transferred unless the government also agrees and so on. And also since 2010, even you do it offshore, you still have to pay taxes in China for the real estate appreciation, but still doing it offshore, you can of course play a little bit with the figures and it goes much faster. But yes, in short, yes, that is often really the lucky part, the lucky aspect.
Thanks a lot for that. I think adding a little bit of nuance to such a complicated topic, and we didn't even get into the real gritty part of it. It's been very enlightening for me, at least. Everybody will get a copy of this presentation. And once again, also a link to the YouTube recording of this as well. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Bjarne, so much for sharing your insights. And once again, if you guys have any questions you'd like to follow up with any of our speakers, their email addresses are right here, so you can contact them. Thanks a lot again, everybody, for joining.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry for speaking a bit too long, and now we don't really have time for the Q&A anymore. Apologies, but really, we'll be happy to answer questions by email, by phone, by LinkedIn. You can easily find us.
Thanks a lot, everybody. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.